Picture this. You're standing inside Rome's imperial palace, where the air is heavy with incense and the gleam of torches flickers against marble walls. The most powerful men in the empire, senators, generals, priests, have gathered, their faces strained between reverence and disbelief. At the center stands Emperor Nero, draped in shimmering gold, every gesture theatrical, every step demanding worship, and beside him, not a noblewoman, not a princess from some faraway land, but a young boy. His head is lowered, his body trembling beneath the weight of silken robes. Upon that fragile frame, Nero gently lowers a bridal veil, his lips curling into a triumphant smile. The court gasps quietly, but no one dares speak. The whispers ripple like a forbidden wind. Is the emperor truly marrying a boy? A castrated boy? Yet the music swells and the ceremony continues, unstoppable. Nero takes the boy's hand and lifts it high, presenting him proudly to the Roman elite, not as a servant, not as a ward, but as his wife. The boy, stripped of choice and of his very manhood, is crowned Empress of Rome in all but name. It is a moment as surreal as it is horrifying. The empire that once prided itself on conquest and discipline now bows to the delusions of a grieving tyrant. And you, watching, realize this is no rumor, no exaggeration. Rome's emperor has just married a castrated child. Before we dive deeper into this disturbing chapter of Roman history, take a moment to support the channel. If you're fascinated by the hidden and shocking sides of the past, hitting that like button helps us bring more stories like this to you. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, because we uncover the kinds of histories you'll never find in your school textbooks. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Now, let's step back in time and see how Rome ever ached this moment. To understand how Rome reached such a bizarre and tragic moment, we first need to look at the man at the center of it all, Nero. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Nero became emperor at just 16. At first, Rome hoped he might be a golden prince, but it didn't take long for his darker nature to surface. Known for his extravagance, theatrical passions, and ruthless paranoia, Nero quickly earned a reputation as one of history's most infamous tyrants. But one person seemed to anchor him, Poppaea Sabina. She was not only celebrated for her beauty, but also for her influence over Nero. Poppaea knew how to soothe his insecurities and feed his ambitions, and soon she became his greatest obsession. Yet their love story ended in horror. During a violent quarrel, Nero, in a fit of rage, struck her. Poppaea, pregnant at the time, died from the blow. Rome was shocked, but none dared challenge the emperor. For Nero, the loss was unbearable. Obsessed with her memory, he could not accept that she was gone. Instead of mourning quietly, he began searching for someone, anyone, who could replace her. And in this, Nero's madness intersected with the darker realities of Roman society. Rome was a world built on hierarchy and exploitation. Slavery was everywhere. Young boys, known as delicati, were prized for their beauty and often kept as ornaments in elite households. Castration, though not common, was not unheard of. Eunuchs sometimes served in roles of intimacy or courtly service, their bodies reshaped to fit the desires of their masters. It was within this decadent culture, where power meant absolute ownership over other human beings, that Nero's obsession took its final, horrific form. If he could not have Poppaea, then he would make her again. While Nero mourned Poppaea, somewhere far from the marble palaces of Rome, a boy named Sporus lived a life too. Hat was simple, ordinary, and fleetingly happy. His exact origins are debated. Some say he was Greek, others suggest he came from the eastern provinces. But what we do know is that he was young, delicate in appearance, and strikingly beautiful in a way that would one day seal his fate. Imagine him as any other child of the empire. Perhaps he played in dusty courtyards with friends. Perhaps he listened to his mother's stories at night, or watched his father labor to provide for the family. His world would have been filled with the small certainties of ordinary life, family, laughter, and the quiet hope of growing into adulthood. But innocence in Rome could be fragile, especially when beauty caught the wrong eyes. Nero's agents, ever watchful for ways to appease their emperor, noticed the boy. What struck them most was not just his youth, but an uncanny resemblance. Sporus looked like Poppaea. His features were soft, his frame delicate, his gaze gentle, enough to stir the emperor's twisted grief. The agents saw in him not a boy, but an opportunity. In a society where power meant ownership, Sporus's fate was decided before he could even understand what was happening. One day he was simply a child, the next he was taken, pulled from the safety of his family, and thrust into the machinery of imperial Rome. For Sporus, the contrast must have been terrifying. Gone were the familiar voices, the comfort of home, the innocence of youth. In their place came dread, whispers of the emperor, of transformation, of being chosen not for who he was, but for who he resembled. This was the moment where his story diverged from countless other boys of Rome. Most children grew up to live ordinary lives, some as citizens, others as slaves. But Sporus had been marked for something darker. He was no longer simply Sporus. He was the shadow of Poppaea, a vessel for Nero's obsession, and from this point forward, his life would no longer belong to him. The moment Sporus was taken into Nero's world, his fate was sealed. What followed was not was the theft of childhood, but the deliberate destruction of his very identity. Nero's servants, obeying their emperor's command, prepared the boy for a transformation that could never be undone. Physicians were summoned. Sporus, trembling, was forced onto a table. The marble floor, once cold beneath his bare feet, now became the stage for his mutilation. Roman medicine was brutal and crude, sharp knives, heated instruments, and no real anesthetic. The boy's screams would have echoed down the palace corridors as the irreversible act was carried out. His body was broken to serve a fantasy, his manhood stolen, his future erased. When it was done, he was no longer viewed as a boy at all. He was remade, against his will, into a shadow of Poppaea. Attendants dressed him in silks, taught him how to walk with grace, and forced him to adopt the gestures of a woman. His very name, Sporus, was spoken with derision, as if he were no longer a person, but an object, a living echo of Nero's dead wife. And then came the most grotesque spectacle of all, the wedding. Rome's emperor declared himself the groom, and before the city's most powerful men, Sporus was unveiled as the bride. Draped in bridal robes, his face veiled, the boy was paraded as if he were the empress herself, returned from the grave. The ritual unfolded with all the grandeur of imperial ceremony, the torches, the musicians, the solemn vows. Senators sat frozen in disbelief, whispering their horror behind tight lips, but none dared intervene. To resist Nero was to invite death. And so, Rome's emperor kissed his boy bride, sealing a union that blurred the line between grief, madness, and cruelty. Sporus, humiliated and terrified, was displayed not as a victim, but as a spectacle, proof of Nero's power to reshape life itself to his desires. The marriage did not end at the ceremony. Nero treated Sporus as his wife in Eve, Rye way. At banquets he would sit beside him, veiled and adorned like an empress. In public, he paraded him before the people, daring them to laugh, to whisper, to acknowledge his scandalous obsession. The empire that once conquered nations now bowed to the emperor's delusion. For Sporus, this was the peak of his nightmare. His boyhood was gone. His future was gone. Even his identity was erased. He existed only as Nero's grotesque creation, a living reminder of the madness that had taken hold of Rome. Imagine waking up each morning not as yourself, but as someone else's fantasy. That was Sporus's reality inside the gilded cages of Nero's palace. From the moment of his marriage, Sporus's life was carefully engineered to erase any trace of his original self. He was trained like an actor in a never-ending performance. Tutors drilled him in how to walk with measured elegance, how to bow his head modestly, how to let his voice rise in softer tones. Every gesture was scripted, every word rehearsed. He was no longer allowed to laugh like a boy or carry himself with the strength of youth. Instead, he had to embody Poppaea, the empress who no longer lived, yet still haunted Nero's every thought. Attendants clothed him in the finest silks, dyed in imperial purple. Jewelers fitted him with necklaces and rings once worn by Poppaea herself. Even his hair was curled and styled in elaborate fashions that took hours to perfect. When he passed a mirror, he no longer saw a frightened boy. He saw a stranger, a painted doll, a ghost in borrowed skin. But the cruelty wasn't just in the training, it was in the way Nero forced intimacy. At feasts, Sporus was paraded beside the emperor, his hand placed deliberately on Nero's arm. Guests would watch as the emperor kissed him publicly, calling him by Poppaea's name. Senators clinked their cups and offered congratulations, but behind their smiles were whispers of disgust. Still, none dared laugh too loudly. To mock the Marine Ball, emperor's wife was to sign your own death warrant. At banquets, the humiliation cut even deeper. Nero delighted in showing Sporus off, presenting him like a prize jewel. He would command musicians to sing love songs to the couple, forcing the entire hall to applaud their union. Sporus had to smile, to play the role of a devoted empress, even as the pit in his stomach grew heavier with every performance. Outside the palace, the charade continued. Nero paraded Sporus through Rome in a golden litter, veiled like a bride. Crowds gathered, some silent in disbelief, others whispering behind their hands. "That's no woman," they murmured. "That's the boy Nero castrated." But no one dared say it too loudly. Rome had become a stage where one man's delusion dictated reality, and everyone else was forced to play along. The cruelest irony was in his very name. Sporus wasn't just what he was called. It was a reminder of what he had lost. In Latin, it suggested seed or sown, a mocking echo of fertility denied. Nero's court may have dressed him as an empress, but the name was a constant reminder that he could never bear children, never grow into manhood, never be who he truly was meant to be. Inside the palace walls, life was suffocating. Sporus had his own staff, his own chambers, even wealth, but it was a luxury soaked in humiliation. Every servant who bowed to him did so not out of respect for who he was, but because he was Nero's obsession. Every jewel he wore was a shackle. Every feast, every ceremony, every forced kiss, another reminder that he was no longer a person, only a reflection of a dead woman. And yet, he survived. That might be the most haunting detail of all. Day after day, year after year, Sporus played his role so perfectly that even Nero seemed convinced. The emperor would reminisce about moments he had shared with Poppaea, and Sporus had to nod, to smile, to pretend he remembered them too. Imagine the weight of that, being forced to live someone else's memories while your own life slowly disappeared. Rome watched in uneasy silence. Some called it madness, others decadence, but for Sporus it was simply survival. Each day was a test, of endurance, of obedience, of how long he could maintain the fiction that he was not himself, but someone else entirely. This was life with Nero. Endless performance, public humiliation, and private torment, and through it all, one truth remained. The boy named Sporus had been erased. In his place stood a living doll, crafted by an emperor's grief and cruelty. Out in the streets of Rome, the spectacle of Nero's marriage spread like wildfire. Senators had witnessed it firsthand, the emperor in golden robes, the boy Sporus veiled like a bride, and though they clapped in the moment, their whispers afterward dripped with scorn. Behind closed doors they mocked the absurdity. Rome, ruled by a groom and his eunuch bride, they sneered. But in the Senate chambers, their faces remained stone. To laugh too loudly, to question too directly, was to invite death. So they played along, even as contempt for Nero festered beneath their togas. Among the common people, gossip flowed more freely. In the bustling markets, fishmongers and bakers traded rumors along with their goods. "Did you hear? The emperor has taken a boy for his wife." Some spoke with disgust, others with dark amusement. Romans had seen decadence before, but this, a castrated child paraded as empress, crossed into territory that felt more like satire than rule. For ordinary citizens struggling with taxes, shortages, and Nero's endless building projects, the scandal was just another sign that their emperor had lost touch with reality. And yet, nobody dared to openly protest. Rome had become a place where truth was dangerous, where mocking the emperor could cost your life. Still, the whispers mattered. They eroded respect, planting seeds of doubt about Nero's ability to govern. Well, what kind of man ruled not with wisdom or strength, but with delusions and cruelty? What kind of empire forced its citizens to applaud a nightmare dressed as a wedding? Politically, the marriage of Sporus revealed something deeper, the emperor's total disregard for Roman traditions and dignity. Roman power had always been tied to ideas of masculinity, family, and discipline. Nero shattered those ideals with his public performance. To the elite, it wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. If an emperor could bend reality so far, what boundaries remained? Senators began to wonder if such a man was fit to rule. The timing couldn't have been worse for Nero. Rebellions were already simmering in the provinces. Military commanders, the true backbone of imperial power, watched Rome's decadence with disgust. Each shocking rumor about Nero, each bizarre display of extravagance chipped away at the loyalty of men who held legions under their command. The wedding to Sporus became a symbol not just of Nero's madness, but of an empire rotting from the top down. For Sporus himself, the whispers added another layer of torment. Wherever he went, eyes followed. To some, he was an object of pity, a boy robbed of his future. To others, he was a joke, a living caricature of Nero's insanity. Either way, he was never seen as human, only as an extension of the emperor's shame. And so the story of a single boy, forced into a grotesque role, began to shape the fate of the empire itself. The private tragedy of Sporus became public ammunition. Nero thought he had crafted a fantasy, Poppaea reborn, but in reality he had handed his enemies the perfect symbol of his corruption. The empire was watching. The streets buzzed with rumors. The Senate seethed with silent mockery. And the legions, hearing tales of their emperor marrying a castrated boy, began to weigh their loyalty. Rome's stability was cracking, and Sporus's suffering stood at the very center of that fracture. By the year 68 CE, the cracks in Nero's rule had widened into full rebellion. The Senate, once cowed into silence, finally found its courage. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, turned against him, lured by promises of safety and power under new leadership. The man who had demanded worship as a living god suddenly found himself abandoned. When word reached Nero that the Senate had declared him a public enemy, panic consumed him. The palaces that once echoed with music and feasts became prisons of fear. His so-called friends vanished, servants fled, and courtiers who once praised him now hid from his sight. Yet through it all, one figure remained by his side, Sporus. The boy who had been stripped of his identity, forced into the role of wife, now stood as Nero's last companion. Together, they fled Rome, slipping through gardens and villas under cover of night. In a bizarre, almost tender way, Nero clung to him, the ghost of Poppaea, recreated in fragile flesh, but even Sporus could not save him from what was coming. Cornered in a villa outside the city, Nero realized the end was near. Soldiers were on their way. Terrified of capture, he begged for courage, and with a final act of desperation, he drove a blade into his throat. "What an artist dies in me," he is said to have cried. Rome's infamous emperor was gone. But for Sporus, the nightmare continued. With Nero dead, he became a possession to be passed along. First, he was taken by Otho, another of Poppaea's former husbands, a cruel echo of the past. Later, when Otho fell, Sporus was claimed by Vitellius, the short-lived emperor who saw him as little more than a curiosity. It was under Vitellius that Sporus faced his final humiliation. The emperor devised a grotesque spectacle. Sporus would be forced to play the role of Proserpina, the goddess of the underworld, in a staged rape during the gladiatorial games. It was not theater. It was degradation on the grandest stage of Rome, watched by tens of thousands. Faced with this fate, Sporus made his choice. Rather than endure one more violation, he ended his own life. The boy who had been stolen, reshaped and paraded as an empress, now seized the only agency left to him, the power to say no. And with that act, Sporus's tragic story came to its close. He entered history as a ghost of someone else, a boy who was never allowed to be himself. His death was not just the end of a life, but a final, damning reflection of an empire that consumed the innocent to feed the delusions of the powerful. And now, stepping back from the story itself, let's reflect on what Sporus's life really means. History often remembers emperors, generals, and conquerors, but beneath their power lies a trail of forgotten lives. People like Sporus, whose only crime was being young, beautiful, and vulnerable in the wrong place at the wrong time. His story is more than just a bizarre scandal from Rome. It is a window into how absolute power consumes the powerless. Nero had the authority to bend reality to his will. He could take a boy and erase his name, his body, and his future, all to satisfy his obsession. To Nero, Sporus wasn't a person. He was a shadow of Poppaea, a living ornament of grief. This is how power dehumanizes, by turning human beings into objects, into tools, into symbols. But Sporus also stands for something larger. He represents countless silenced voices across history. Slaves, servants, captives, children, whose stories were never written down, whose pain was never remembered. We only know Sporus because his suffering was tied to the spectacle of an emperor. How many others vanished without a trace? And perhaps most hauntingly, this pattern isn't locked in the past. Even today, in different forms, the young and vulnerable are still exploited for the desires of the powerful. The costumes change, the settings shift, but the dynamic remains chillingly familiar. So when we tell stories like this, we do more than recount scandal. We give voice, however faint, to someone history tried to erase. Sporus's life may have been twisted by an emperor's madness, but by remembering him, we restore a fragment of his humanity. And that leaves us with a question for you. What other hidden lives from history deserve to be remembered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes the most important lessons don't come from emperors. They come from the victims they tried to silence.